Very good. 8 years ago, I went to the movie theater to see a film called An Inconvenient Truth, which was a documentary film about climate change. Now, by a show of hands, how many of you happen to have seen that movie? Okay, almost all of you, but for those of you who didn't, it's a story about how Al Gore, after the 2000 election, having lost, he tried to decide what he was going to do with himself. And so he decided to focus on one of the topic areas of most interest to him, and that was on global warming. He put together a slideshow and traveled the country, traveled the world, explaining the facts about climate change. Eventually, they made a movie about him giving this slideshow, and the movie won an Academy Award, and eventually he won a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to educate the public. Well, last year in August, I decided to get trained by the Climate Reality Project, which is the nonprofit that he started to educate the public about climate change. This is an organization that has trained 8,000 volunteers like myself around the world to learn the facts about climate change, and to, since they can't make a movie every single year to update the facts, they rely on us, the 8,000 volunteers, to go around in our neighborhoods to share those facts. So last year in August, I went to Chicago, and here we were for 3 days, and of which one day, Al Gore himself, he trained us for 8 hours on these facts. And we were there. It was a wonderful conference. I joined 1,200 people from 70 countries and all 50 states. People from Ecuador or Greece and Turkey, Japan, Taiwan, and so forth. Even Virginia, my hometown. People were there from all over. It was very inspiring. They had a lot of religious people, Buddhists and Confucianists there probably as well, along with Muslims and Catholics. And, but what occurred to me as I sat there with so many dedicated people learning about the facts was that this map here, which I've printed out and put on your desks, and hopefully it's something that'll be interesting to post in your classrooms. This is a spot map. It's an atlas of carbon dioxide emissions for 2011. And over the size of the bubbles refers to how much carbon dioxide is being emitted by each country. And so on the right side, the big bubble there, China has the leading CO2 emissions with 7.7 gigatons that year, followed by the United States in red on the left-hand side with 5.4, and even some small countries down here like Argentina. You can look at the small Africa as a whole, quite small, and so forth. It's just one way of visualizing the impact of carbon dioxide emissions and who's responsible. So you can imagine there I stood with, there I sat with 70 other countries. Most of the other countries are small bubbles. I was, as an American, I'm from the red bubble on the left, but being a Chinese American, I'm what's known as an ABC, an American-born Chinese from Washington, D.C. and Virginia. I can relate a lot to the blue bubble on the right-hand side. And as I sat in the room there of people and thinking, when we leave this room and we go back into our communities to try to educate the public, which are the bubbles that are most important that the people of those countries act? Right? Well, it's obviously the Americans and the Chinese are the central players today in the climate dialogue. And if we don't get those people to the table, unless we educate the people in those countries about what's happening, then all the little guys from the little bubbles, even with all their enthusiasm, it's really not going to make so much of a difference. And so I feel, as a Chinese American, a special opportunity, or maybe an obligation, being part of the two biggest bubbles there, to try to do something, because we're the ones that can do something about climate change. All of us in the room, teachers who talk to students, we're really representing the biggest bubbles there. And your interest in China is furthermore, I think, foundational to our workshop for yesterday and today to try to understand the big picture around China and the background, as well as some of the very specific issues. And I would say that the climate change discussion is paramount to our moving forward. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share with you about 12 minutes of some slides from the Al Gore's most current slideshow presentation. It'll just be an excerpt of some of the general topics plus his slides around China and the US issues. And then I'll add some some extra slides of my own that relate to how I think you could bring this into the classroom and some of the timing of major climate negotiations happening in the next 18 months, okay? And then, so let's just get started. The first slide here is a picture taken of the Earth in 1968 with the first Apollo mission to the moon. And this photograph reminds us how delicate the Earth is and the one planet all the people we share on this Earth. And soon after that photograph was taken, the Earth Day was started, and the modern environmental movement happened because of greater awareness of the Earth. Now, what's been happening to the Earth since that photo was taken? This is a time-lapse photo from 1800s into the present, showing the change of temperature, with red and yellow being hotter than average and blue and white being cooler than average temperatures. And as we get to the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, 2000 and 2012, 2013, you can see clearly that the temperature, the average temperature of the Earth has been rising in the last 50 years. In fact, the 12 hottest years on record have all been since 1998. Now, this photograph was taken by the International Space Station, and it looks sideways at our atmosphere. And the point of it is to show that our atmosphere is actually very thin. Sometimes when we go outside in California and we look up at the enormous sky, we say, wow, that's ginormous. It's just impossible that anything we small humans could do could impact the enormous atmosphere. But the atmosphere is actually pretty thin. If we had a basketball and we covered it with a layer of saran wrap, the thinness of that saran wrap layer is about the relative thinness of our atmosphere. And so when humans drive cars or burn coal in order to generate electricity and we release carbon pollution into the air, it does create a type of a blanket in that thin atmosphere, which does have an impact in holding more heat, trapping more heat on the Earth. When we look at the global carbon emissions from fossil fuels, this chart will show from 1850 to the present that most of the carbon emissions has been occurring since the industrial age after the 1950s, a dramatic increase in the amount used. And if we look, that was looking backwards. Now, if we look forwards at the potential energy consumption, well, we're going to keep using fossil fuels in the future. And this blue line shows the world's usage of fossil fuels, excluding India and China. What happens, though, when you add India and China, you see that over half of the growth in consumption will come from just those two countries alone. And I want you to remember that, because that topic of India and China's threat or of continued usage is what's in the back of American politicians' mind. And they're very worried about the upper green-hand side. Now, why do we worry about carbon dioxide concentration in our environment? This chart here shows, it goes back 800,000 years to show the carbon dioxide concentration being between roughly 200 to 300 parts per million over the last 800,000 years. Sorry, it's a little dark, but you can see the blue lines going up and down. Underneath in white is the temperature of the Earth during that time. And what you'll see is that there's a close correlation to the times when the concentration of CO2 was high and the temperature was high. And when the concentration was low, that's when we had our ice ages. Now, where we stand today in 2013, unfortunately, the CO2 concentration has just reached 400 parts per million. Now, remember I told you that in the last 800,000 years, it always was between 200 and 300. So going to 400 parts per million is something we haven't seen in 800,000 years. And if we continue on this path for the next 40 or 50 years, the scientists project that we will hit 600 parts per million in just the next 40 years. So if you can see the difference between an ice age is just like this distance down here, and then the amount going up. On the hot side, that's pretty frightful for the direction we're headed. And one of the reasons that with warmer air, with the warming temperature, warmer air can hold a lot more water vapor. To be exact, each 1 degree centigrade of increased temperature has 7% more water vapor in our atmosphere. And I know this, you know this, because when we get out of the shower, you see in the top of the bathroom has the steam in it, and the bottom of the bathroom, it doesn't have it, because the warmer air at the top of the shower can hold more moisture than the bottom of the shower. And so what happens to our atmosphere is that right now we have 4% more water vapor over our oceans than there was just 30 years ago. When you have more water vapor in the atmosphere, when it does rain, that water vapor goes somewhere. It actually comes down in rainstorms, for example. And the flooding that we've experienced around the world recently, and I'll just share some of the photos with you, have been, the worst storms in 50 years, 100 years, 150 years. Here's in Pakistan. In India, they had over 400% of the rain in summer of 2013, last summer. In China in 2012, there were torrential rains and floods. Again, they hadn't seen these in 60, 70 years. In North Korea, even significant flooding. Brazil, last Christmas. A year ago in Mozambique, Africa, Mexico. There are like 70 slides on floods. I'm only going to just show you 10, Argentina. But just to give you an idea, these are all taken within the last year. We don't really see it in the news, but when you see it all together and you understand the science of why, sure it was going to rain anyways, but the fact there's more moisture in the air means it's raining harder and it's coming down more. So that's one important thing to understand, that the ocean, the same extra heat that's coming out of the ocean, however, has a converse effect on dry land of evaporating waters out of our soil. So on the one hand, we have floods and storms, and on the other hand, we have droughts. In China, they had the worst drought in 50 years here. This lake dried up. This is the biggest freshwater lake in China, Poying Lake, and that had reduced by, I think, a third or a half of its size during that period. And so there was significant, again, in Wuhan, Hebei province, the biggest drought in 50-some years. In 2011, this was a map of the drought showing the red and the extremely and inordinately dry portions of the country. So a significant portion of the country that year was in drought. And that's, we know it now as a fact here in California because the United States itself in 2012 had the drought. 2013 there was further drought. And here we sit in January, in 2014, when in January the governor announced emergency measures to preserve water. Here is a lake in California, down in San Jose. Anybody near the Almaden Reservoir and take a peek at that. Apparently there was an old car discovered here that had been illegally dumped, and because the water level was so low, they found the car down in the Almaden Reservoir. Take a look at Folsom Lake in 2011 versus today in 2012. That's that before and after, and see where we're at. So let's take another change of pace and go up. What's happening with warming temperatures when you're looking at our glaciers up in Alaska? The Muir Glacier from 1880 and compared to today. These are melted and not to be seen again. The Peru Glacier, 1978, and how much it's receded in 2000s. So when you have that melting of the glaciers, you have more of the water flowing into the oceans. Who's going to be at risk? Bangladesh is one of the countries most at risk because it has so much low-lying land. And flooding from the sea level rise and the storm surges pushes more of the ocean water, salty water up into the land. And what happens here, for instance, in this picture in Egypt of this farmer, Mohammed Hamid, land has now become infertile due to the saltwater intrusion. In the Nile Delta, they're responsible for 1/3 of the fruit in Africa. And if there's salinization of that Nile Delta area, that could seriously threaten the food supply in Africa. So these are some of the downsides that we're seeing. And back to our spot map, but if you looked at whether it be Egypt or Bangladesh, those are very small spots on the spot map, right? So those guys that farmer right there, he's not probably going to be able to do so much about climate change as we in this room and our society here in America, and that the Chinese could be doing. We know we have to change from all of the damages that we've seen so far, and because in China, in addition to carbon pollution, there's just plain old pollution that makes breathing all those particulates so dangerous. We heard from several of the speakers about the particulate matter and the need to wear face masks during those periods of time. In fact, China's air pollution has cut life expectancy by an average of 5.5 years in the north of the country, and this is what the Shanghai Academy of Sciences had to say earlier this year. The pollution index in Beijing nears extreme levels, and is near a level that is no longer livable for human beings. yesterday, Gang He showed us a chart, remember, of Beijing and all those blue lines, and he said that those blue lines were going up to like 600 or 700, and he showed you that on the bottom, the WHO had some guidelines for it. I wanted to say that here in California, you know when we have a spare the air day? You know what number it is when it triggers this warning sign, we've got to spare the air? What number is it between 1 and 600? 30, 15? 5. It's 100. 100 is, it triggers a spare the air day in California. But as we saw, the recommended would be like 30 to 50. And yet you saw that graph that how many days are over 300 or 400 or 500. And then you can understand that second sentence there, that it is no longer livable for human beings, the extreme challenges they face there. Check out this baby who needs oxygen. Having oxygen in China, not so uncommon. Take a look at this picture of Beijing on a clear day. And take that building there. And whoops, on a foggy day, all gone, sorry. Another photo of before and after. This one in January 2013. Tends to be in the winter time more than the summer. February of 2012, the CCTV tower. Can't see it. So just examples to bring it to life. And we know they're burning so much coal there. We saw that yesterday. China, remember, burns how much of the world's coal? 50%. Remember that was half of the pie chart in red. 50% of the coal is being burned, of the world's coal is being burned in China. China relies on coal for over 70% of its electricity needs. But the coal industry, and this is the US coal industry, has talked about clean coal for a long time. If you go back to the 1920s, you see advertisements for clean coal. In the 1940s, there were still messages that we can, there's clean coal. The 70s, we're doing research on clean coal. And 1979, yes, coal can be clean before it's burned inside and out. The 80s talk about clean coal, all the way really up to the present, where clean coal is now cool, with sunglasses even. Now, does those sunglasses remind you of anybody or anything? Yeah, it is. Take a look at what it reminds me of is the tobacco industry, Joe Cool. And so it's interesting to talk about the tobacco industry in light of the fossil fuel industry, because 50 years ago this year, the Surgeon General of the United States announced what? That tobacco smoking might be harmful to your health. And what did the tobacco industry do? They said, well, gee, that may not be true. They paraded out doctors who smoked and said, maybe the science is not clear. Don't move so fast on banning cigarettes. And by the way, if we ban cigarettes and reduce smoking, that would be terrible for our economy. What about the tobacco growers? What about the people selling cigarettes? It would really demolish our economy. We shouldn't have these rules. And I think a lot of the dialogue we see today from the fossil fuel industry is very similar in saying how it's important to keep a strong economy. And so I think that as a society, it's partly true. People will be displaced. These are good debates to have. It's not like really a right or wrong discussion, but it is a question that they have strong parallels. And so the coal industry now has plenty of advertising out there and something good for your students to watch and study, and maybe even relate it to the tobacco advertising of 40 and 50 years ago. The Climate Reality Project has two missions in its educational effort. It's striving to put a price on carbon pollution in the markets. If it's free to pollute, then people are going to pollute with no consequence. But if you could put a price on it, it could use market forces to find a solution. And the other effort by the Climate Reality Project is to put a price on denial for those American politicians who are saying it's not happening and who are trying to delay for change. There are those who deny the existence of the climate crisis and say there's not a scientific consensus, but what we have learned since the movie came out 8 years ago is that there's every National Academy of Science of every major country in the world has now concluded that anthropogenic global warming, human-caused global warming, that the Earth is getting warmer and that humans are the cause. You can see China and the United States on this. And the number of academies of science who said, no, it's not happening, they're none. In fact, 97 or 98% of climate scientists, those people who specialize in this area, have agreed that, again, it's human caused and it is happening. But that does leave the 3% out there who are very prolific writers and get a lot of airtime to publicize that message. Sometimes it seems like a 50-50 debate when the scientists that are most involved, it is not actually a 50-50. There are solutions on hand. They're in the renewables, wind business, the United States. The solar industry has caught on greatly. This is in Southern California, San Francisco Airport, our own Sunset Reservoir. Anybody teach over in the Sunset? All right, so you can go visit, take your students to that largest energy plant in California, solar energy. China, Xi Jinping, when he was vice president, he did acknowledge that it's very important to quicken the pace of renewable adoption. And even our president, Barack Obama, in his second term, is focusing more on climate change. And in this quote, he talks about how the debate is settled and we should really move forward for the sake of our children. But what's next, and what can we do, or what should we do as teachers and educators? Well, I don't have the answers, but I do think that here, I will leave you with a couple slides, which I hope you can use to generate some discussion in your class. There isn't a day that goes by that there's some information about climate change. This is a recent survey by Ipsos Mori that asked, to what extent do you agree or disagree with this question? That climate change we are currently seeing is largely the result of human activity. China, out of 20 major countries, China was the most liked. 93% of people agreed to that statement, with 5% disagreeing. So 93% said it's human activity that's causing it. The number 20 on the list of 20 was the United States, where 54% agreed that's happening and 32% disagreed. Now, down there was Great Britain, Australia, Russia, and up there was Argentina, Italy, and Spain. But I think that's why education is important. Why, you could ask as a question to your students, why do the Chinese think one way, and why do we have different opinions? These are good. I don't know the answer to this question, but I'm trying to myself work on educating the public and hoping that we can learn more and get the facts. Now, this is for your classes, the next 18 months are very critical and very interesting from an international climate negotiations perspective. So I wanted to highlight a few dates. September 23rd, only 6 weeks away, is the United Nations Climate Summit, where Ban Ki-moon, General Secretary Ban Ki-moon, specially called this summit together because he knew it was such an important time to get this dialogue going. And in particular, he asked and requested for Obama and Xi Jinping themselves to attend. And just like 2 weeks ago, they both accepted the invitation and will be in New York on September 23rd. So right when school gets started, if you're interested in this topic, that'd be a good time to be looking at the news to see what's happening at this climate summit and to see what type of dialogue is taking place. The next major milestone is on December of this year in Lima, Peru. The United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change will have its major conference, Conference of Participants, COP20, in Lima. And then the major one after that is a year from now in Paris in December of 2015. Now, in the Paris conference, it's critical. They have the COP, 20, 21, whatever we're up to now. But 21 in Paris was deemed to be the conference where all major countries were going to put their commitments on the table, and we were going to do something about it. Everybody had to do it. They agreed to that in 2011 in Durban, that 2015 would be the target date. So, it's just not another conference in the minds of these organizers. It's got to happen in Paris, or that, because that's it. The gun is to our head. So this is a very interesting 18 months to get students involved in this. And again, I think the major players of the US and China seeing what is happening will be fascinating. I didn't have to look far to look in Sunday, August 3rd, that was the day before yesterday. Representative Ed Whitfield from Kentucky said, all pain for America, all gain for China, when in reference to climate action. He said, with growing economies and energy demands in China, India, and the rest of the developing world, America's so-called leadership on climate change is highly unlikely to succeed and very likely to backfire. US jobs and economic opportunity will be lost to countries hungry for affordable energy. President Obama's climate plan is all pain for Americans and all gain for China. So you'll find that type of dialogue, and that's something that is debatable, discussable in a classroom. And I want to go back to He Gong's chart from yesterday because it was a lot of information, but I think this is a key way of understanding why American congressmen and American people think that. If you look on the left-hand side, this is 2012 annual emissions of carbon dioxide, which is sort of like the spot maps that you have. It shows China with 26% of the world's the biggest polluter. America is in second place. So naturally, American congressmen are looking at this chart saying, hey, China, you better do something about it. Why should we do something if you and India are not going to do something? The Chinese, on the other hand, are looking at the right-hand pie, which was from 1751 to 2012, all the emissions of the past. And it says, wait a second, you guys in America put up 26% of all the greenhouse gases up there, and they do last for hundreds and hundreds of years, CO2. And so you're responsible for most of the problems. Why should we? We're only 10%. Why should the Chinese do something and act now? You Americans need to act first and show us what's done. And in fact, the Chinese would then point to the per capita CO2 emissions, and I'll blow that up so you can see this, and say it's really a question of equity and fairness, because you developed countries became industrialized through the use of fossil fuels, and all of you guys burn a heck of a lot to become rich countries. Now look at us, China and India. It's our turn. It's our turn to become industrialized. We need those fuels to enjoy the same affluence that your countries did. This is also a very good topic of discussion, equity and fairness of what would be fair then to India and China. In the editorial pages, you can see dueling editorials. Here's the Wall Street Journal on June of 2014. It also cites, of the 30 billion tons of carbon out there, the US is only responsible for 5.5. That was the 15%. Mr. Obama's logic seems to be that the US should first set a moral example by imposing costs that reduce our prosperity. This will then inspire China, which produces and consumes nearly as much coal as the rest of the world combined. Again, that was that pie chart with China having 50%, to do the same to its 300 million people who still live on pennies a day. Good luck persuading Xi Jinping. And he goes on to, the editorial is basically against the EPA regulations on coal plants. USA Today, again, just 2 days ago said, it's true that unilateral US action can't save the planet, but as the two biggest emitters of greenhouse gases, China and America hold the key on global warming. If the US acts to curb emissions, it puts pressure on China to go along. If it doesn't, it gives China an excuse to delay. So there's a lot going on out there, I think, framing the issues, and hopefully through the workshops of yesterday and today, you can understand the complexities of this issue. But I do think even focusing on this one is a good way for students to get involved and ultimately to help, would say, save our planet and do something that the adults of today are not really taking the action that we need in China and the US, and we have to do it quickly. So I'm very hopeful and thankful that you've spent the time here with us to learn more. I think that this spot map in the chart to show really just sums up what the challenge we face in front of us. So this is my contact information. And let me just say, as I close that, these slides are only allowed to be presented by climate reality presenters, so I can't just hand you all the slides, but many of them are distributable, so I'll go back and put in the box net eventually, maybe within a week, just some the slides that are permitted to be used. I will take out the name Climate Reality Project, but the key slides will be in there with some of the photos. I didn't want to cut it all out because I wanted you to see it, but now that you've seen it, when you see the abbreviated version, hopefully you'll be able to adapt it for your own uses. Okay? Thank you very much for your attention.